Hello, hello, and welcome to the My Sugar-Free Journey podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Ann Childers. So Dr. Childers is a child and adult-trained psychiatric physician with a special interest in regaining the physical and mental health of children, adolescents, and adults through standard psychiatric care integrated with principles of nutrition and sleep. And this is why this idea of integrating mental health with nutrition is why she's here, because I find that to be very interesting, and I find it also to be something that we're not spending a whole lot of time talking about. That your diet doesn't just affect your physical health, it affects your brain as well, affects your mental health, it affects what you think, how you can think and how well you can think and cognate and interact with the world. So I think this is an idea that needs to get out into the zeitgeist a little bit more than what it is. So Dr. Ann, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It's nice to meet you.
Yes, I appreciate that. So before we get into the kind of the meat of the things that I want to talk about, let's talk about you a little bit. What is your background? When did you decide that you wanted to be a psychiatrist? And probably more importantly, how did you figure out the link between nutrition and mental health?
Okay, I'll start back with the link between nutrition and mental health.
Okay.
I was a dog trainer for about 12 to 14 years, somewhere in there. And we had a lot of facilities in the Portland, Oregon metropolitan area. And we saw about 200 to 300 dogs a week. So we were very familiar with the dogs. We were also familiar with their diets. We had a couple of diets back then. This is back in the 80s that we would recommend. And it was very interesting because the cheaper diets left animals in a state of anxiety in many cases. And you could actually see it in their eyes. There was a lot of matter around their eyes. They were shaking. They were irritable. And they had a greasy coat with dandruff. It was really clear that they were missing some fatty acids. The better diets gave you hands full of fat. It was amazing. Back then, the IMC Canuba was one of the top-end diets at the time, and it was loaded with chicken fat. And it was very interesting how much better the animals looked. Now, I realize that veterinarians now are saying be cautious with fat, etc. Okay. But I think what we have to acknowledge is that mammals do need some source of fat, even if they manufacture it themselves. And in the case of carnivores, and I think humans are, we have to take it in often from a dietary source, or we can make it. We can make it from carbohydrates. So fatty acids are extremely important in the diet. We will get them one way or another. And the animals that looked the best, that had the beautiful coats, that had clear eyes, they had moist pads, moist noses, they were calmer and they were ready to learn. So
real quick, I have to tell you my dog story because I love to tell the story. It was probably about 3 years ago. We have this boxer mix down here, and she's at my feet right now, that she woke up one morning and half of her face didn't work. And her tongue was out of the side of her mouth. Her jowls were hanging down. She couldn't move one side of her face. I was like, okay, my dog had a stroke overnight. That's obviously what has happened. So I took her to the vet, and the vet checked her out, and he goes, well, the good news here is I don't think it was a stroke. I think it was Bell's palsy. And I said, okay, well, how do you fix that? She goes, we don't know. This may be permanent. It may go away, after a few weeks. But we know what causes it. It's inflammation. There's a nerve that goes, he pointed where it went from. Yeah. And this nerve is inflamed. And if the inflammation goes down, the Bell's palsy will go away. And I thought, well, I know how to reduce inflammation in me. Just not eat sugars and grains. And the inflammation went down in my body. And so I asked the doctor, can this dog eat just meat? And he said, no, you really need to, feed her kibble and everything. And so I said, okay. So I went home and did a little research. Well, that was wrong. Dogs don't need grain. So we switched her over to a mostly carnivore very ketogenic diet, and Bell's palsy went away. She's got more health, more vitality. She's still alive, and she's 12 or 13 years old,
Had a
and she's
girl.
great. She got lots of energy, and it was just all dietary change.
Right. No, diet is a big deal, and that's
Yeah.
where I started to
She's,
catch on. But I
didn't
didn't
mean
catch
to
on
interrupt
for
me. Go
myself.
ahead.
I'm sorry.
Mhm.
Yeah, I didn't catch on for
No, I
myself.
was just saying I didn't want to interrupt you. Okay.
Oh, okay. So, so I actually ended up getting sick over the ensuing decades because I was eating what I was taught in medical school. I went to medical school at age 33, and they taught me to eat no fat, zero fat. They even used some kind of a demonstration where they had this plate where they kept loading up fat from every kind of food and making it look like the whole plate was full by the end of the day. And like, that was a really bad thing.
Yeah.
So of course, I went deep in. I went not only just non-fat milk, but non-fat powdered milk, which is basically this industrial, sometimes I call these things industrial sludge. Really and truly, they're just not meant for human consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought I was doing my body a favor. So after medical school, I basically got sick. My bones became brittle, and I had problems thinking. And I think the big aha moment for me was when I had an organizer come to my home and label my shelves so that I would put the dishes back in the same place every time. I could not organize my thinking well enough to do that. And I was only in my 40s, right? So I had the organizer over, and I loaded my coffee with powdered milk, thinking I was going to get some protein. And within about an hour, I couldn't think well enough to drive. Wow. So I knew something had to change. That's when I knew something had to change. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I did get it kind of from the dogs. The dogs taught me a lot, but it took a long time for me to get it about my own self. Even though I was highly trained, I was a physician, I was a psychiatrist at the time. I learned about the powdered milk. Wow, right? I can't imagine what it's like for the general population.
Yeah. How did you decide that it was fat that you needed? Okay. Like, what was the first fat that you put in? What was those first kind of baby steps like?
Well, as you can tell, I'm the kind of person who goes all in. Yeah. So I went all in on no fat. Yep. And then I went on I read Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston A. Price.
Yeah.
And then I found out about the Weston A. Price Foundation.
Yeah.
Which was established in 1999. They're still there, by the way. Their website is still up. And I learned how important it was for me to get natural fats in my diet. Yep. So I was no longer on the powdered milk, but now I was actually searching for farms where I could get the raw milk that was recommended by Weston A. Price, which they said would be restorative. It was a good restorative and nourishing food for me. And from there, I learned how to make kefir out of it. I had these mason jars full of milk that were actually half dairy fat. And instead of getting another stroke, I'd had a stroke in 2003. It was minor, but it was a shot over the bow because my two sisters are disabled from stroke.
Oh my goodness.
So I had that minor stroke, and I thought, I hope this doesn't give me a stroke. And if anything, I had 50% occlusion in this carotid artery at the time, and my most recent measurement said 17% occlusion. So I don't think it was hurting, and it might have been helping. Yeah. And I learned how to eat meat with fat. And I learned how to eat closer to the ground, more natural foods, whole foods. And that was the beginning of my journey until I found out I had type 2 diabetes. And then that's when I realized I had to go keto. So I've been keto for about maybe 13 years, something like that, 12 to 13 years.
So you have there been, I noticed you got just a little bit of a shake. Have there been any long-term, other things that you still experience because of what happened then?
I think this is from what happened then. I think
Okay.
it showed up on an MRI probably in about 2003, 2004. My head was shaking back then.
Okay.
But what I had before that was called torticollis, where my head pulled off to the side. In the Air Force, I would salute like this.
Mm.
And I didn't know why my head was doing that. I had no idea. And then I later
Wow.
learned out that it was dystonia. Thank goodness, because I was concerned about something more damaging. So
Oh
the
yeah.
dystonia became more apparent around 2016,
Okay.
but it's been coming on for a long time.
Yeah.
Fortunately, it's mostly affecting my head and neck, so I don't. I used to
Man, I'm
have
shaking.
I used to have Botox shots in my neck, but I got a head droop, and I'd have to say hello to you like this. So I decided I can live with the shakes.
Okay, well that makes sense. That's funny. Yeah, the number of stories that I get from people who were on like a low carb or low fat or some kind of vegan diet, and Leah Keith was another one that's been on this podcast, and the just the crazy physical things that she's had to suffer with because of 20 years of eating a vegan totally fat free diet. It's terrible. Your body needs fat. So you went through the Air Force. Now you're a medical doctor in practice.
Mhm.
Uh, but I don't, I see by your qualifications, you're an MD. How are you, how are you working on psychiatry as an MD? Like how are those things coming together?
Okay, so after I learned, I also had terrible insomnia when I was eating badly.
Mm,
That has gone away, thank goodness. I feel rested. But
good.
I learned from my experience, from my overall experience, that there were two things that every human being really, really needs. I mean, there are more than that. There's shelter, there's a feeling of belonging, there are a lot of things. But the two things that I could work on, that I could actually help people get control of in my practice, number one, nutrition, and
Mhm.
sometimes sleep by extension, but also sleep. So
Yep.
those two actually go together. People who sleep poorly often crave junk. They often have higher blood sugars than the regular population. So really, the two. I don't know if I could really say number one, number two. I think they're probably number one and number
Yeah.
one. But in any case, once I started implementing that in my practice, I started getting people into remission. So I won't say that I don't prescribe medications, but I don't think medications are enough in most cases. I think people need to know
Yeah.
how to maximize sleep and how to maximize their nutrition.
Fatigue for me is the one thing that I have to watch out for. It took me a long time to learn, but once I made that connection that when I eat more and I eat worse foods when I'm fatigued, that
Mhm.
now because I work an odd shift. I work 4 a.m. to noon.
Uh-huh.
That if I only get 3 4 hours of sleep before I'm able to go in and start my shift, I have to think and start my day with, okay, you're tired, you're fatigued, pay very close attention to what you want to eat, make good decisions, and I have to kind of walk myself through instead of, I'd love to be. You hear about people that are doing intuitive eating, and they just kind of intuit that they want to eat healthy foods. Some days I can do that,
Yeah.
um, but the more fatigued I am, the more effort it takes to make sure I'm not eating something that I shouldn't eat. So that's definitely true for me.
Oh, yeah. And I think quick carbs are quick energy sources. So it's
Yeah.
a natural. But my carb cravings got to the point where I would visit the frosting aisle for lunch.
Oh my gosh.
I know. I showed
Yes, I
my
have done
husband
that.
that. He was like horrified. We've been married 4 years, and I finally broke the secret. I said,
That's
okay,
funny.
this is what I lived on. And pie cherries, pudding. I mean, it's interesting. One of my patients told me that when she got back from the hospital, she looked around her apartment and it was full of empty pudding cups.
That's funny. Yeah,
Yeah, she had
I've
been
done that.
junking out on her food binge, and it didn't help her. So what I'm finding is that any foods that I can give my patients to help them stabilize blood sugars are all to the good.
And we talk about this a lot in this podcast, but let's just, for everyone's education, let's go through what those foods are. What are you telling your clients to eat?
Well, one of the things that I do is on many of my patients, what I will do is put a continuous glucose monitor on them.
Oh, okay. All right.
Right. And I use the Abbott Freestyle Libre Pro. Of the three most popular glucose monitors on the market, it's probably slightly less accurate, but what you see with the Abbott is trends. And that's what I'm trying to find for my patients. And we can always pick out trends. It's fantastic. So I see both hyperglycemia, high blood sugar, as well as hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. In fact, I had a very normal patient, except for problems with anger and irritability, who in the lab, blood sugars sunk to 21. That is in the area where people start getting a coma,
dead,
or they have seizures. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and she was not keto. If she had been keto, she probably would have done better with it, but she wasn't. And she was having frequent episodes of hypoglycemia, and they were severe to the point where she'd become combative. So that was an eye-opener, because she came to me with the idea that maybe she was bipolar, but all of her mood swings were happening during the same day, which doesn't meet criteria from a psychiatric standpoint.
So they were meal triggered.
Meal related. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
within a couple hours, the meal. Yeah.
So this was, I'm assuming, somebody whose pancreas dumped out a ton of insulin every time they ate, and that's what was happening, is it was forcing their blood sugar down to the floor.
That's what I thought, but then I got her oral glucose tolerance test with insulin. And what it looks like to me, but I sent her up to my alma mater, Oregon Health and Science University in Oregon. I guess that was redundant, right? Anyway, I sent her to my alma mater for a better workup, because what we were wondering, the consultant at OHSU and I were wondering whether her liver was bailing her out in time, because it looked like her insulin and her glucose were tracking the way that we would expect. Maybe not as far apart in number, but it just seemed that her body allowed her to get down too low before the glycogen came. So she may have, I don't know, she may have some error of metabolism. I have no way to explain what happened, and I look forward to seeing what the experts say.
Most people don't realize that they think of the liver as mostly a filtration organ that cleans your blood. Yes. But if you took your liver out, you'd die of hypoglycemia long before your blood would turn toxic. I mean, that's what the liver's job is to keep sugar, in your bloodstream and keep you going. Mm-hmm. So you're starting to see these connections between psychiatric disorders and diet. Mm-hmm. What is it about the modern standard American diet that you think is causing the psychiatric disorders? And real quick, here's why I'm asking this. Here's why I'm asking this question. I have a theory. I don't know how much science backs it up, but here's my theory. That one of the reasons that we're seeing so much crazy stuff from our kids, that these school shootings, these the rates of suicide are going up among teenagers, the rates of the rates of violence like school shootings, all of these things are ticking up, and we're seeing way more psychiatric medication, psychiatric prescriptions being given to people under the age of, let's say, 25. A lot more now, and maybe just because these psychiatric medications exist where they didn't 50 years ago, a lot more now than before. And my theory is that we're seeing the results of a 75-year-long experiment where we've changed the diet and the effect of the change in diet affects each subsequent generation a little bit more severely.
Yeah.
So now we're kind of at the tail end of this long experiment where our kids just do not have the tools necessary to deal with adversity, to deal with, and there are a lot of other factors, the way parents are raising their kids, the pills that these kids are on. I think there's a ton of factors, but I know deep in my heart that at least one of the factors, if not the biggest factor, is diet. So that's where this question is coming from. What are you seeing, or what is it about the standard American diet that is affecting the brains, all of our brains, but especially the brains of our youngest and most vulnerable in these detrimental ways?
Okay, so my theory is that it's a mixture. It's a mixture of diet and sleep.
And sleep. Mm-hmm.
Kids aren't sleeping.
Yeah.
They're not sleeping. Big deal. Lots of blue light that they're getting. It cuts off that melatonin. It makes it very difficult for them to get rest at night. We've also got heavier kids now, and it's blocking the airway. So they end up snoring. A lot of these kids are wetting the bed because they have sleep apnea. It's embarrassing. They can't go on outings. They can't adjust socially because of all that's happening. Is it diet related? Yes. We have ultra-processed foods, including processed milks that are getting into schools. They're lower in fat. They don't allow children to feel satisfied with their meals. And so they eat more during the day and they get bigger. They eat more calories than what they need. And because they're getting bigger, and because they're eating ultra-processed foods, they don't have the energy that they need to go outside and play. They just want to sitting in front of a television set or video game is fine with them. Right. Whereas, we had the jiggers in our legs. I mean, we, in the 1950s and 60s, man, we were outside most of the day, but a lot of these kids don't even feel like getting up, much less in the morning. And we have like early school start times. So teenagers don't get enough sleep. Kids who are adolescents, whose bodies want to go to sleep later and get up later, they don't have that opportunity. So they're not ready for school. And then when they go to school, they don't make the grades, and parents are unhappy. They are unhappy. Their friends are unhappy. It's like morning of the living dead in the hallways as kids stumble around toward their lockers. In addition, they're eating foods that don't allow them to sleep. They are eating foods that cause actually hypoglycemia in the middle of the night. They'll eat a very starchy, ultra-processed food before bedtime, and they'll be up in the middle of the night before you know it and wondering how they can get back to sleep. Their parents are too, by the way. Yep. So it's not just limited. So we have whole families now that are sleep deprived and don't feel well. They just don't feel well. And I think if I was to get rid of one thing, just one thing, I'd get rid of cereals and other ultra-processed foods. Just get rid of those. Get everybody on a whole foods diet. If we could roll things back time-wise, we'd be a lot better off.
Yep. Yeah, I totally think so as well. Now, we know the brain is 75% fat. Is there
60 to 70, somewhere in there, yeah.
60 to 70. Is there something about dietary fat that allows the body to repair and maintain the brain better?
Yeah, I think some of the best studied fats are the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. And while it's controversial whether it's going to help the heart, there are some limited studies that suggest they may help the brain. I think how it helps to conceptualize, let's see how to say this. Okay. The best way to conceptualize it is that each neuron, each brain cell that's a nerve cell has a skin, kind of a skin on it. It's called a membrane. It's surrounded by a membrane. That's its skin. Okay. And that skin is made of fatty rafts. We call them lipid rafts. And among them are omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. And when those are out of balance, we suspect that they may not conduct nerve impulses as well as they would if they were in balance. So when you look at a long axon that has long fingers, kind of like my arm here with fingers at the end, do you see that? That would be the arm of the axon, and this would be what they call the dendrites, the connection to the next cell, right? If you think of that as being covered in a raft of lipids, if it doesn't have the right balance, it can't be as efficient with its conduction. So for your brain to be alive and vital and be at its best, you really need to have a good balance. There's probably more to this than what I'm telling you. But the other thing is keeping blood sugars from spiking. Glucose spikes are bad for the brain. I repeat, glucose spikes are bad for the brain. They just are. We
now,
know
are glucose spikes bad for the brain because the glucose is bad for the brain or because the insulin is bad for the brain?
Both.
Both. Okay.
Both. Or both, because it changes insulin signaling. Insulin signaling in the brain is different than it is in the body, but it's also very delicate. In fact, we're starting to call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes.
I've heard this.
Type 3 diabetes, yes. Yeah. So I've had, so we know, for example, in type 2 diabetics who have high blood sugars consistently, we know that they complain of problems with doing calculations and doing other mental work. A lot of people call that brain fog. And so people that have these high spikes often have some interruption in their ability to think. And these high spikes are more likely to lead to hypoglycemia. It's after a spike like this that someone is more likely to get a low blood sugar. And when they have low blood sugar, they're often anxious, sweating, hungry, angry, and they're not thinking well either. So you can imagine what this roller coaster looks like with high and then low and then high and then low blood sugars. And that's what you get when you eat ultra-processed foods for the most part. Cereal and skim milk, if you look at the sugar spikes from that, Stanford did a study with a continuous glucose monitor, and they found that cornflakes were the worst offender. Unsweetened cornflakes. Unsweetened cornflakes. So I did an experiment on myself using unsweetened Cheerios, and I got a sugar spike with just 1 cup of unsweetened Cheerios, about 20-some grams of carbohydrate, far less than that 75 that you get for a glucose tolerance test, right? About 21, 22 grams of carbohydrate, and that's with the skim milk. My blood sugar shot up to 178.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know. Boom, right? Drop the mic. Okay, so I took away, now this is where it gets interesting. I took away the non-fat milk, and I added 1 tablespoon of heavy cream instead. That was equal calories. Half cup non-fat milk, 50 tablespoon. Did I say teaspoon? I should have said tablespoon. Okay. Tablespoon of heavy cream, 50 calories. Guess what? It hovered around maybe 90 to 100 and never really varied. So
the
taking
fat
out of the diet.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. You started to say.
I was just saying the fat mediates the effect of your insulin's ability to lower that blood sugar, which we've been told to drink 2% milk, put 2% milk in our cereal, and we're feeding. I mean, I know families right now that feed their kids a bowl of cereal with 2% milk every single morning, and then ship them off to school and can't figure out why they're making C pluses and everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, I did a subsequent experiment with 2 Snickers bars.
Oh, yeah? Let's hear about this. Because Snickers bar has fat.
Right? Mm-hmm. So it went up to about 136, 138.
Not enough fat.
Well, but still, that's darn good, don't you think?
Yeah, it's better than what you got with just the cereal.
Yeah, and it was about the same number of carbohydrates in both.
Yeah. That's interesting.
So fat does moderate the glycemic index of foods. And I think taking that fat away was a big mistake.
so there's something here that, because a lot of Americans will eat fat and carbs at the same meal, and they'll eat the hamburger with the bun and the French fries, or they'll eat the pork roast with the potatoes, or whatever, fill in the whatever, and and um, and so there's something protective as far as blood sugar goes about doing that. But at the same time, I think that type of eating damages the liver more long term. So there's something going on there, because I think the liver is really good at processing carbs. I think the liver is really good at processing fat. I think the liver is terrible at processing both fat and carbs at the same time. It just doesn't do a good job with that. So I think you're trading one bad thing for another. If you're mixing fat with your carbs, you're blunting the blood sugar effect, but you're damaging the liver long term. And I wonder if there's been a study that looks at both of those things.
I don't know. I'll be honest, but I can tell you that anecdotally, growing up in the 60s and 70s, we didn't have these body composition problems that people have today, and nobody ran, nobody went to the gym, right? Okay, we smoked a lot more. That's true, but you'll see in Woodstock, you'll see guys with six-pack abs who never earned them. So I think there is a body composition that comes from the right balance of things. And I think that after 1977, when we had the dietary guidelines for Americans, things became out of balance. So while I'm keto, I don't think every single person has to go keto. In fact, if I could get all of my patients to go paleo, I would be perfectly happy with that, as if they didn't emphasize, like, if they didn't go overboard on sweet potatoes or things like that. I think it would be A-okay fine. If they put meat at the bottom of the pyramid, meat, fish, eggs, poultry, all with their fats, I think they would do very well. But I think grains, and especially ultra-processed foods made of them, they're hurting us. And I think the sooner we realize this, the better.
So I want to get back to mental health a little bit, because that's the part that I think that you have expertise in that not a lot of my podcast guests do. So we've talked a little bit about how diet affects mental health. You gave us one, but can you give us a few more case studies, we'll call them, people that have come in with different maladies, you've changed their diet, or even a diet plus exercise plus medication, or however you handled it, and have seen some impressive things happen?
Okay, so I can tell you that one of the very first things that I do is check people's iron stores, especially women of reproductive age. And also I ask a lot of questions about magnesium. And the reason I ask about magnesium is because it's very hard to test for magnesium. No matter how the levels are, almost every time you're going to get a normal serum level. Right. So questions like, I just start from head to toe. I say, do you get headaches? Do you grind your teeth? Do you get shoulder tension? Do you have tremors? Do you have constipation? Do you get cramps in your feet or legs? Then that person is a very good candidate for magnesium, because one of the things about a high grain diet and everyday stress in America is it just whips through your magnesium like nobody's business.
Yes.
So almost everyone qualifies for a magnesium supplement. Not hydroxide, not oxide, none of those. It's going to have to be citrate, or it's going to have to be some kind of magnesium salt that is easy to absorb. I have my favorites, but read about that. If you're interested in magnesium, read about that, because not all magnesium is created equal, and some is just so cheap. It's so cheap and it does absolutely nothing, and you think you're doing something for yourself.
You know who Vinny Tortorich is?
I'm sorry?
You know who Vinny Tortorich is?
Yeah, I've podcasted with him.
Oh, have you? Okay. So he has put out a magnesium thing. I forget, the Pure Vitamin Club. And his magnesium tablet is the only supplement I've ever taken in my entire life where after I took it, I felt the difference. Usually I take a vitamin and I was like, oh, who knows if that's working. His magnesium, I took it about an hour before I went to bed, and I was out like a light. Like
Yep.
I could not believe how deep
It
my
helps
sleep was
people
after that
sleep.
magnesium.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. I think it's great.
Fantastic.
Yep.
And then the other thing is ferritin. We're warned against eating red meat. That is a huge mistake, especially for women of reproductive age and for children, because red meat is one of our only sources and one of our richest sources of heme iron.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you can get it from chicken liver. Who eats that anymore? You can get it from beef liver. Who eats that anymore, right? Oh, I do. Okay. So veal liver, same problem, right? Clams and mussels and oysters. Okay, those are great sources, but not a big part of the American diet, let's
Right.
face it. So, and if you tried to go with plants, you'd have to eat twice the iron to get the same amount. And it would be only under certain conditions, such as
And it's
taking.
not heme iron, right? It's some
It's
other
not
type of iron.
very hard to absorb.
Yeah.
Plants don't like giving it up.
Yeah.
So anyway, and then the other thing is milk products with a meal will bind iron. So will coffee and tea. So
Oh.
it makes it even harder to get that heme iron. So almost, and a lot of the symptoms of iron deficiency look like anxiety and depression.
Huh. That's interesting.
So, and same with magnesium. A lot of the magnesium signs and symptoms, such as low energy, loss of sleep, overlap with things like anxiety and depression. So if I don't take care of all these pieces of the puzzle, if I don't put it all together, I'm not going to be able to get this person into remission.
That is so interesting. So you're looking at electrolytes as well.
Yes, I am.
So magnesium, as well as heme. That's so fascinating. I would not have thought. I mean, I know magnesium is important for muscle, retracting muscle and digestion and everything. I would not have imagined it would be important for brain health as well. That's really fascinating.
It's really excellent. Speaking of brain health, I had a situation with a patient who had epilepsy, and it was really interesting. The glucose monitor showed that at the point that she was having epileptic seizures, she had low blood glucose, and at the point she was seeing auras, she had high blood glucose during the day. So I can't tell you that high blood glucose is auras and low is seizures, but I do know that either high or low blood glucose makes it more likely that someone will have a problem with a seizure or aura. I can also tell you that the ketogenic diet was first developed for children with seizures. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting to me how stabilizing a lower carbohydrate diet is. And I wonder in my thought, we do use anti-epileptic drugs as mood stabilizers. Is the ketogenic diet mood stabilizing, or is a lower carbohydrate diet mood stabilizing? I would argue that it is, but I don't have the scientific basis to prove it. So.
Okay, so let's. I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about something else that has become a little more near and dear to my heart lately. There is there's a national debate right now about marijuana use, and there is in fact, I listened to the Joe Rogan podcast, and he's fascinating because he's very pro cannabis. But he just recently about 3 or 4 months ago, did a debate basically on his podcast between a pro-cannabis person and an anti-cannabis person. And one of the things that came out of that was the higher rates of things like psychosis and these other mental disorders in cannabis users. Now, one of the things that was left unclear was if this was something that was triggering a psychotic events, or if this was, this was already a population that was destined to have these psychotic events, and the marijuana use was incidental to it, who knows. But I think one thing that is becoming a little more clear is that the younger you are when you start using marijuana, it looks like the effects of marijuana could be worse for you if you're already kind of genetically predisposed to having psychotic events and things like that. Now, I know this is something that you've done some research into. So can you talk about marijuana use and mental health?
Okay, so it's really interesting to me. So I'm going to put some pieces of this puzzle together, but I don't know if it's scientifically valid, all right? Okay. Because right now, studies in this area are in their infancy. And part of the reasons for that is because from a U.S. government perspective, cannabis is a Schedule I drug. Right. It has no redeeming medical value, according to the U.S. government. And therefore, there are lots and lots of hoops, just as with heroin, which is in the same class. Schedule I. There are lots and lots of hoops that get in the way of adequately studying it, including that researchers who want to get cannabis to study have to get them from one place, and I understand that one place doesn't have very good stuff. So there are lots of obstacles in the way of adequately studying cannabis. So when people read this or that about cannabis, it's not really based on thorough studies, even though cannabis has been around for a long, long time. It's been legal in Oregon for years now, and we're starting to see a step up in use of early adolescence and middle to late adolescence. And we think that this is more harmful to persons under the age of 26. So the brain develops fully by age 26. Okay. There's also a very interesting situation with genotype. And genotype is not something that we've been entirely aware of. In fact, my practice is one of the few practices that actually collects genetics from the patient to see how they may respond to medication. There is a gene for an enzyme, catechol-O-methyltransferase, COMT. And there are several genotypes which are throughout our population. One is the MET, which we think may be more inclined toward anxiety. There's VAL-MET, which is considered to be, quote, normal, whatever that is, because frankly, like I said, these genotypes run throughout the population. And then there's VAL-VAL. VAL-VAL tends to look more and behave more like someone with ADHD. There's lower dopamine in the frontal lobe. And so they may be the skateboarders and firefighters, the heroes of our civilization. Now, here's the interesting thing about that to me, is that persons with ADHD symptoms tend to gravitate toward cannabis. And yet they are by far, according to preliminary investigations, which means we don't have the final answer, but preliminary investigations show that they are also by far more likely to have some type of a psychotic disorder by age 26 if they're early users.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if some of the trends in teen violence that we're seeing, like school shootings and that, I wonder if marijuana use doesn't have a part to play in that as well.
Yeah, I don't know.
And it's so multifactorial. It's so hard to kind of to pin it down. Who knows? I mean, and maybe we'll never know. And there may just be too many factors to tease out. Now, just to be clear about one thing you said about being a Schedule I drug and having no medical value. I mean, we don't think that, right? I mean, obviously, marijuana has some medical value in for some people. Would you agree with that?
I might think that, but it hasn't been well studied.
Okay.
That's what I'm thinking. Okay. Because of all these obstacles in the way. The other thing is today's marijuana is not your great grandpa's marijuana.
Yeah,
Trust
definitely.
me, it is a totally more concentrated, heavy duty creature.
Yep.
And I think that hasn't been studied either. So as I understand it, the stuff that people can get to study are more like from generations back. But we have much, people are going, stronger, faster. They're going for whatever that holy grail is that's going to give you the most bang for your buck, so to speak. And I don't think we have all the information about that.
Okay.
I really
That's
don't.
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Ann, I really appreciate you coming on. If you can tell my listeners where they can find out more about you, follow you on most social media, that kind of thing, I think they would be interested in that.
Yeah, please join me and my followers and the people that I follow on Twitter, Ann Childers,
Okay.
MD, otherwise known as
Ann
Dr.
Childers.
Ann.
Okay.
So, and you can also find me at lifebalancenw.com. That's where you can find my blogs. And let's see, where else can you find me? Yeah, I think that's it for right now.
Perfect. All right, guys, I'm going to put links to all of that in the show notes. So you can go to mysugarfreejourney.com/podcast to find links to all of that stuff there and anything else that we talked about in this podcast. Dr. Ann, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Aaron. It's been a delight.
I appreciate it. All right, guys, hold on. We'll be right back with some more information.